Alright, when you first open the box, you'll notice a 1/4 inch thick wooden template. This is going to be used along with a set of PVC tubes and hardware to secure it to the existing TL70 bell housing for marking your cut lines. The centerpiece here was an early attempt to create something of a clearance gauge, but we just decided to ditch the whole thing. It was going to be more trouble than what it was worth. So if your kit comes with it, just throw it in the trash. There is a small piece of paper with some written instructions on it, as well as a QR code that you can scan if you want written form of these instructions. The first Ziploc bag contains all of the template hardware, the PVC tubing, which is pre-cut to a specified length, as well as the pilot bushing adapter. The TL70 has a much shorter input shaft and smaller pilot bearing diameter, so we are supplying a machined adapter that will go in the back of the Datsun crank and bottom out. It will also engage the pilot dowel on the TL70 input shaft so you get proper clutch alignment. You'll notice there is a small threaded section here, and that is so that you're able to remove it at a later date. Onto the bell housing portion, you'll notice just like the CT009 bell housing, this one comes with a machined and doweled front bearing cover, which we are going to offer a small credit back of $50 if you ship us your new or lightly used undamaged cover. You shouldn't need to remove this cover from your bell housing during the install, as it's already pre-located with dowels. Go ahead and get your transmission up on a bench or a work fixture and start installing the template. If you take all 4 PVC tubes out of the Ziploc bag, you'll notice one of them is taller than the rest and has a red paint mark across it. This goes in a specific spot where the starter would normally attach to the TL70 bell housing. This casting here is slightly thinner than the remaining areas where normal bell housing bolts will go through, so if you overlook this step, you'll end up with a crooked template and a crooked cut line, which could possibly cause an issue, so make sure you pay attention. Place the rest of your PVC tubes in these spots here shown in the video so they all line up with the pre-drilled holes in the cutting template. The template only goes on one way, so if it doesn't fit, just flip it around until it does. Once you get it resting on all your PVC tubes, shove the bolts through and finger tighten them. If you impact them on or even wrench them, you'll break the template or split the PVC tubes, or you'll just tweak it, so you really only need to finger tighten it. Go ahead and start scribing your cut lines along the bell housing. It always helps to have a new Sharpie with plenty of ink and a fresh tip. If you're running on a used transmission, clean it up as best as you can because you don't want to be mixing grease with the Sharpie. We decided the best way to manage cutting it is going to be marking it from both sides of the template. The rearward facing line is going to be your sand line, and your front facing mark is going to be your actual cut line. And we'll elaborate more on this further along in the video, but for now, just mark it on both sides of the template. Really try to get in there as close to the edge of the template as possible when making your marks. Take your time, this isn't necessarily rocket science, but it does need to be fairly accurate to make sure you get a good cut. This transmission bell housing is exponentially harder to cut than the CT009. In fact, we worked on 4 different transmissions in filming this video just to make sure that we had the process nailed down so that we could give you as accurate of an instruction set as possible. Now on to tooling. You can pretty much consider it a mandatory purchase if you want to do this cut as accurate as possible. You need a 7-inch angle grinder. This particular one we use is Bauer from Harbor Freight. It's relatively inexpensive, and for a transmission swap like this, it's really a negligible expense, all things considered. Honestly, for what we spent for this Bauer angle grinder, we've beat the absolute hell out of it, and we just can't kill it. Make sure you get a couple of good cutting wheels as well as a sanding disc. It would also be helpful to get a 4-inch angle grinder for a couple of the smaller cuts, as well as for the finish sanding to help speed up the process and not have to constantly swap wheels. You'll see later in the video where this is really helpful. Before we start our cut, I just want you to prepare yourself. This is not as straightforward as the CT009. The surface of the TL70 is not dimensionally friendly for a straight cut line, so just work slow and steady and take your time. If you rush through this, you're going to screw something up. Like I said, we're professionals and we still took 4 tries to get it just right, so hopefully you guys will be able to benefit from the many mistakes that we made. If you're a professional shop watching this video and you're trying to gauge how much labor to build your customer, so far Bo and I have set our labor time at 5.5 hours for the cut, new bell housing install, and shifter assembly setup. A good strategy to employ here is just to graze the cut mark all the way around first, to create a small groove in the casting all the way around the bell housing, and then you have a channel for your cutoff wheel to ride in as you cut deeper. Don't get overzealous with the cutting because you'll need to turn in your old cover if you want that $50 credit. We mentioned a 4-inch angle grinder a little earlier. This is where it would come in handy for cutting these small areas before the bell housing is completely separated. We like to dig in as far as we can with a 7-inch angle grinder and leave a small little bit of these fins and come in from the inside of the bell housing to cut them. You can squeeze a 7-inch angle grinder in there if you want, but it's a tight fit, it's a little harder to control. You can't really see what you're doing. You can just come in perpendicular from these casting fins to make a separation cut. You're going to be finished sanding them anyways for clearance at a later point. The only other potential issue is the casting for the internal casing. There are a few areas where this is really close. The cutting of the bell housing fins for the backside is really the only way to finish the cut without potentially damaging your transmission case. This is where finesse is an asset. I can't reiterate enough that you really need to take your time with this cut. You can always take more material off, but it's exponentially harder to add it back. Once the bell housing is off, you're still not in the clear. You still have a ton of work to do. You need to cut off the factory clutch fork pivot ball and the casting boss. Luckily, no fluid goes through this area, so it's a simple cut and finish. Sand will take care of it. Take extra precautions not to slip and nick the front bearing cover or the transmission casing. We are not going to accept any front bearing covers that have deep gouges or cut marks from slipping cut off wheels. Once you get the pivot ball boss cut off and finish sanded, you're going to need to cut up the casing fins at a slight angle to clear the new bell housing. Bo is making it look like it's a quick and easy job, but that's just because he did 3 previously, so he knew exactly how much to cut off. But this will be another area to take your time in. This is going to require multiple small cuts and test fitting of the bell housing to look for any contact areas. We're going to spare you having to watch us install and remove the bell housing repeatedly to check for clearance, but basically you'll be needing to make small cuts and adjustments until the bell housing clears the TL70 case. Just keep working at it between making small cuts and sanding until you're fairly confident that it's not contacting anymore. Once you are confident that it's not contacting anymore, you'll need to do a clearance check. I highly advise using some type of modeling clay. However, at the time of filming this video, apparently all of the modeling clay at Amazon was 3 to 4 days out. So in a pinch, bearing grease will work. It's just a little messier. Put clay or bearing grease around the entire footprint of the new bell housing. If you're not sure, just refer to the back side of the bell housing and follow the pattern on the inside of it. There are a couple of small black oxide threaded studs in the hardware bag. You're going to use this as a guide for sliding the new bell housing on. Go ahead and just remove the factory front bearing cover and install these studs in by hand in the opposing spots across from each other. Just tighten it with 2 bolts for now until you get it seated, and give it a perimeter once over where the bell housing meets the casing. And look for any potential areas of contact. Those casting fins that you cut at an angle are now going to be a major contact point until you finally get them trimmed and sanded enough. On the underside of the bell housing, all of these fins need to be cut by sort of a freehand method until it's no longer contacting. These don't really serve as any kind of structural support. However, if you want it to look nice and uniform for cosmetic reasons, try and take off as little material as possible until the fins go into the machine recesses in the bell housing. After this visual check, take the bolts back out and remove the bell housing. If you're using clay, if you have an area that has full contact, the clay should be completely squeezed out and basically bare metal sitting there. If you're using bearing grease, the same principle applies, so just look for bearing grease that was squeezed out. This is a solid indicator for contact, and these areas need to be trimmed and sanded until they're no longer contacting. If you're happy with the clearance around the entire perimeter, move on to applying FIPG to the front bearing cover. FIPG stands for Form in Place Gasket, and it can be purchased at any Toyota dealer. They sell 3 types, just make sure you buy the orange type, which is meant for transmission and transaxle cases. I'm a former Toyota expert level tech, and if you use the wrong sealant, it's going to leak. Just trust me on that. The correct tube is like $22, so don't skimp. Clean the entire surface on both the bearing cover and the transmission case with brake or carb cleaner. FIPG is really good stuff as long as you don't contaminate it with fresh oil or fluids, so you want the surface completely dry and void of any oil. There are 2 acceptable methods to applying the sealant. One is an 1/8 inch thick bead around the outer perimeter to allow for a small degree of squeeze out when torquing down, or spreading it evenly across the sealing surface with your index finger. As long as you employ one of these 2 methods, you'll get a proper leak-free seal. Once you get the sealant on the front cover, go ahead and slide it over the input shaft and the 2 threaded dowel rods you installed earlier and slide it into place. The hardware kit comes with 4 standard hex bolts and 2 low-profile button-head Allen bolts, and this is for proper clutch fork clearance. Make sure all of your bolts have thread sealant on the threads. We use Permatex white thread paste here in shop, however, putting some of that orange FIPG on the bolt threads is acceptable by Toyota standards. If you don't have something on the threads, you'll get a small oil leak through the threads. We're going to highlight where the button head bolts go here in just a sec, but once the cover is installed, you'll have to install a set of Allen head set screws. These aren't really an imperative part of this process, however, we do feel it adds to the structural rigidity of the part overall. It just gives the bell housing extra points of contact to help negate any vibration and flexing over time. Do not skip over the fact that these set screws need red Loctite. This should be provided in the kit, but it is absolutely imperative that you put red Loctite on the set screw threads so they don't back out. These set screws also don't need to be reefed down tight. They're just as a secondary point of contact. As long as they contact the transmission casing underneath, that's all we need. If you over tighten them, you actually risk flexing the bell housing and torque loading it, which could cause other problems further down the line. Once you're done with that, take a good look as to where the button head Allen bolts go, and we can move on to installing the clutch fork kit. This bell housing requires the use of a 350Z clutch fork and its corresponding components. So that means the fork, pivot ball, washer, springs, dust boot, and the clutch release bearing and the sleeve, all from the 350Z. We sell this on our website if you didn't purchase it initially when you bought your bell housing. We keep these in stock so we can ship them out relatively quickly. First part is install your clutch fork boot in the bell housing and then install the pivot ball retainer spring in the fork. You notice the spring curves towards one direction, and in this orientation the curvature faces upward or toward the pivot ball. If you install it backwards, you won't get the fork to snap onto the pivot ball and it'll fall off during operation. Next is your clutch release bearing retaining spring onto the bearing sleeve, and then onto the 2 small grooves at the end of the fork. Make sure all of your contact areas are greased so they don't seize during operation. Install your pivot ball and washer into the bell housing, and once you get all of that installed, you can start by sliding the small end of the clutch fork through the dust boot and then sliding the bearing sleeve over the front cover. It takes a little bit of working around, but once you get the geometry just right, it slides right into place, and with a good smack of your hand, you should hear a small audible click or thunk to let you know that the pivot ball spring snapped into place. Something else to note, the other part of the machine front cover actually features an additional back cut to the bottom of the bearing sleeve area to allow for proper release bearing geometry. The TL70 front cover has an unmachined casting area that we machined down for use with this swap, which is why we're offering a trade-in credit for sending us your old cover. Thanks for watching, guys. Stay tuned for our upcoming episode on the shifter assembly and all of the other related information for the clutch and flywheel setup. We initially wanted to cover everything in one video, but this transmission swap has so much more information that needs to be covered compared to our CD009 swap. So please like and subscribe to our channel. I'm reshooting a bunch of footage for the shifter install, and we'll be releasing a second video covering that here in a few weeks. Other than that, stay tuned everyone, and thank you all for continuing to support our business.